Yet I find myself continually wrestling with the question of who is my neighbor. And I think the question is being asked at a very special time in our lives, especially as Americans, but specifically also as global citizens. We're living in a moment where there just seems to be global violence, both physical and rhetorical, that spans from the Middle East to Africa, through Europe, Asia, and here in America. I think we're living in a time when we can't figure out whose life matters. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the core of who we are as human beings, I think, is cloaked and hidden under religious and political rhetoric. And so when I think of the question of who is my neighbor, I come from the place where I believe that the land no longer represents a place for communion and sacred shared space, but instead it serves as site for confinement and control. And neighbor is no longer one who lives where you live nor loves you unconditionally, but neighbor becomes a relationship negotiated, structured, and objectified through lenses that are constructing our identities. Therefore, as such, compassion, which is at the core of the question, who is my neighbor, is merely a commodity to be manipulated, bought, sold, and leveraged for access to greater power. In other words, compassion and the question of who is my neighbor is an indication that we are being slowly and incrementally seduced into a value system focused on acquisition of objects, and consequently, we are being exiled from value systems forged on relationships grounded in love. So even as we look at the new text, the first discussion is about love. And then a parable is given, and the question is, well, the question then is, who is my neighbor? And then the parable is given. And so when we ask the question, who is my neighbor, it's a politically charged question. And as people who are always trying to unpack this faith of ours, it is a question that we have to fight and even risk ourselves to answer in ways that bring life here in America and globally. Now, I come to this work as I continually try to unpack the work of my dissertation, which was like the day after the Last Supper. And my work started as a question related to my grandfather. My grandfather was 93 years old. And I was like, my grandfather's 93. I need to have a conversation about what it means to be a Gaddis Sims. And I started asking my grandfather questions. And what shocked me the most was that my life complexion was not grounded in the myth of rape, but in fact was grounded in love. My great-grandmother was of German descent. I thought she was just a light-skinned Black woman. But she was of German descent, and my great-grandfather was African. And they married one another in Mississippi. Can you imagine? And I just asked my grandfather, how is it that at the turn of the century, a white woman and a Black man could be married and neither of them hanged? And as I had further conversations with him, and even more importantly, as I tried to excavate some type of historical understanding of ethnic development and racial development in Mississippi, what I found was by nature, as human beings, we are connected and compassionate. And it's only when a value system that is based on acquisition of things is injected into our midst that we lose an understanding of what it means to be human and how we are to be compassionate and how, without question, we know who our neighbors are. And so as an ethicist, I really started to try to dig. I married history with ethics. And, I compromised all of the rules of history by going back, 100 years, as opposed to the given 50 that you're supposed to be able to travel in order to make some kind of analysis. But, I just started I continued to ask questions. So I asked my grandfather, how is it that a white woman and a black man could be married? And he began to tell the story of our family. Our family history, as he understood it, actually started with the birth of a baby girl named Sarah, whose mother was the daughter of the plantation owner, who was white, and whose father was an Irish overseer, who was also obviously white. The baby was conceived, and then Sarah was taken away out of white space, out of community, and raised by a Choctaw woman named Annie Peterson. And so for me, this complicated this whole notion of being able to embrace these very simplified understandings of black-white, and it made me ask deeper questions about how we came into simplifying our lives based on black people. As a result, I looked at the Choctaw history, and I just saw how this system of confinement and removal destabilized people in order that elites might have access to land and labor and also define what love looked like. So as I looked at Mississippi, I also started to look at other narratives in which this system of confining people to land, cutting up borders and boundaries of land, determining and negotiating the relationships between the people of the land that had once been neighbors, has led to violence not only in the past, but we also see how it is impacting how we're living today. So most of us know about, or have, maybe not, there have been some pretty major shifts in how people's relationships have been negotiated and translated into violence when in many moments in history they were very intimate. The first kind of land confinement and control process that I looked at was the Berlin Conference, in which most of the European countries decided to divvy up Africa in order that they might increase their reach related to colonialism. The second major, I would say, displacement of peoples is related to the division of parts of Asia in about 1914, even before World War I had ended. And my teenage daughter had to teach me this. But it was, and hopefully she taught me the right pronunciation, but it was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which Russia, France, and Britain divided up spaces that we now call the Middle East, where there's so much unrest, so much violence. okay? And the reason this was done, I suggest, is that those particular elites in the countries that they represented grounded who they were in a value system that was based on objects, but even greater, stuck in a whole notion of survival and security. There is a value map, the Hall-Tona value map, that gives us phases of values, right? And at the first phase is survival and security. And the whole idea is the world is a mysterious place, and I've got to figure out a way to control it. Right? And at the other end is a sense that the world is a mysterious place, and let's be creative and interactive and use wisdom to figure out how to live in it peaceably. So here in America, what I want to suggest is that a lot of our country has been founded on a value system that's based on scarcity and based on fear and based on insecurity, which is really what we see in the political arena when we listen to the rhetoric, right? Everything that's spoken is about confining us. Everything that's spoken is about a threat to our security. Everything that's spoken is related to the sense that there's only a little bit of resource available. And so we've got to fight to have access to it. Okay? And then I would suggest that third, I talked about the Berlin, just point at the Berlin conference, and then point to that the Sykes-Picot agreement. But also in America, there have been severe movements to confine and control land, right? We know about Native Americans, right? The whole system: confine, control, remove, and even annihilate. But what we don't think about, especially for those of us in the room, is how the development of HUD, how redlining, how all of the new hopes that are renewing urban spaces have really embraced the same models as Berlin and Sykes-Picot, and now are confining us and controlling us, and have, since before the Civil War, right? And part of that confining and controlling is also to construct identities for each of us so that we know how to relate to one another. And in some senses, in many senses, numbs us and makes us callous to the things that make us human, which is our ability to respond to the misery of others. And so with that, that constant confining and controlling of space, you create spaces, I can't say communities, but you create spaces that have impoverished us all. If it's not financial impoverishment, it's emotional, it's spiritual. And so we are always trying to gain a sense of self in ways that we can only define self based on seeing ourselves in contrast to others. Because we've been taught that relationship is not the foremost thing that makes us human. In my work, what I try to suggest also, or am now trying to work out, is the fact of how these value systems translate into moral tutoring that teaches us how to treat one another. And my theory is, I'm from Chicago, and there's skyscrapers. So you see the height of the skyscraper, but you rarely see the depth of it. And what I want to suggest is that the depths of our skyscraper related to community and communion, compassion, and neighbor, or just how our society is ordered, below the surface are the value systems. Right? And then the value systems are connected to economic systems. And so our country is based on capitalism. Capitalism finds much of its growth and profit in being able to access and control property, whether it's land property or how we make property of people. And then above that system are our governmental structures that create laws that maintain what is below the system. And then above the governmental structure is what I call institutional structures, which is how we operate, especially as educators and theologians. Those institutions include family, education, and religion. And if we don't critique the value system, then we have created institutions that constantly reinforce value systems that leave us in fear, cause confusion, and ultimately causes moral decay. And then above what I would call those institutional structures are media and cultural productions. And so those are the things that we see every day that reinforce these notions of who we are and who, in fact, we are designed to be distanced from. Does that make sense? Okay, so beneath the surface, value systems, right? Above the surface, we have government, we have institutions, and we have cultural productions. So, as people of faith, then what is our response to the question of who is my neighbor? And what I would suggest is that we've got to look at a different value system. It's the value system that Jesus gives to us, right? To love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love neighbor as self. Right? And so with that, I think the essence of our faith is then to confront the structures that have taught us to be removed from our neighbors. Okay? What would our school systems and our counties and our cities look like if we refuse to embrace, even as essential to what it means to be human, if we refuse to embrace the whole idea of differentiation and difference? What would happen to us if we saw every benefit to move as part of the seduction for us to move away from another group? So then what it then does for us is helps us to rethink, I think, what love is. For me, what love is the ability to see the potential in others, and then to commit all of who we are and our resources in order to fulfill that potential with no calculation of how that potential benefits us. So then what would that look like in our political climate? What does that look like for those of us who live in Richmond? Right, where we've got a new process for urban renewal. Are you aware of it? Where they're looking at housing, the government-assisted housing, and the plan is to construct new housing that is spread out into neighborhoods, right? But the amount of new housing is less than the number of people that are in government-assisted housing now. And so what that's going to do is usher in a whole new population of people that are homeless. As I mentioned, I'm from Chicago, and I've seen how this operates. So on the Gold Coast of Chicago, which is an area that borders Lake Michigan, in the 40s and 50s, government housing for African Americans was constructed by displacing people in the community, mostly due to the creation of the expressway that goes through the city. Okay, so there were stable neighborhoods, there were communities. A highway is determined to be constructed through particular neighborhoods, and then housing is built for those families that are displaced. However, in city planning, about 40 years ago, there was the realization that the Gold Coast was a very valuable property. And here you have sitting on Lake Michigan, Great View, housing projects. So systematically, resources were being taken away from the residents in the housing projects. Images were being presented of the residents in the housing projects. So now it's a place of drug addiction, drug abuse. It's a place where the economy is based on sale of drugs. There are crack babies and all these cultural presentations of these neighbors, which then justifies the closing of these housing projects with now scattered site housing for the residents that live there. In Chicago, they closed down housing projects, and just like the plan is in Richmond, there are not enough residences for people to live in that were being constructed. And so they had Section 8 housing. However, with the Section 8 housing, you couldn't benefit from the relocation program if you had outstanding electrical bill. Raise your hand if your bill sometimes is outstanding, electrical bill, right? Or outstanding rent. So if you had outstanding electrical bill and outstanding rent, you could not participate in relocation. And for those families that could participate in relocation, they were now shifted to neighborhoods whose ethos was totally different than the ones that they needed to create for themselves as they had community in the housing projects. So I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood where, like most cities, the residents were aging, their children didn't want to live in the property any longer, so it became Section 8 housing. On my parents' block, there was one house that was Section 8, and my brother counted 35 people that were coming in and out of that house, right? So those of us with middle class values are saying, oh my God, what's going on here, right? Until we asked the right people the right questions, what we found was that that community decided to be compassionate, and those residents that were not allowed to relocate because they had outstanding electric bills or outstanding rent were invited into the homes so that they would not be homeless. In one area in Chicago, for a particular school district, there were over 500 children that were homeless. Right? Why? Because in the city planning for shifting what had been housing projects into condos, there was no care nor concern given to the people that initially resided in those housing projects. No care, no concern, no compassion for the adults, nor the children. Okay? And so we see this in our cities. All cities are going through this transition. I think Chicago has served as the model, right? but it's also the transition that we are seeing globally, where people have been removed, confined, forced into spaces that weren't normally their own. And now, having been displaced so often, one of the things that Mindy Thompson-Fuller, who is a psychologist and also does work in public health, then suggests is that because people are removed, for over 3 generations, they start to experience health-related concerns. And ultimately, violence becomes a language for communication. So we see in Chicago all of the deaths, right? The killings on the south side of Chicago. And we're having conversations about guns, but we're not having conversations about what happens when people are forced into a value system that's more interested in objects than them as persons. And the unfortunate thing for us, those of us in faith communities and theological education is that we have participated in this transition, this carrying away from values related to relationship to values related to object. Right? We've had religious treaties and theological treaties that have suggested that God has created some above and some over, right? We're still having conversations about who has the right to love and where they have the right to live. We're still trying to even suggest that the cross is not a radical rebellion against a value system that's based on objects. Because the same thing was happening in the Greco-Roman world. Displacement and violence and using religion in order to suggest that this is the way that God had intended. And so what I want to suggest is that we have work to do. Dolores Williams in Sisters in the Wilderness, Dolores Williams is a theologian. And what she states is that though most of us have been steeped in an understanding of the life of Christ based on atonement, such that one sacrifices in order that the others may have salvation, what she suggests is that the cross was Jesus saying, even though you kill me, I will be resurrected. In other words, you cannot kill the ministerial vision that is related to reestablishing relationships. Jesus' whole ministry was about reestablishing relationships. Our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, our relationship with nature. And in that is a radical approach when the larger part of the world is invested in value systems that demand distance. And so I think what I just want to do now is invite us to maybe wrestle with what this may mean, what it may mean for us as we've been steeped in a white and black narrative, what it may mean for us in terms of how some of us have been privileged, so much so that we don't even see the poverty of other people. And also to wrestle with the question of, are we willing to risk everything in order to restore compassion in such a way that it's not a commodity to be bought, to be sold, to be controlled and manipulated for access to more power?
Questions from you all?
I've been in Richmond probably since 1970. I worked in social service with foster children. And most record was they worked way back then. And we also had many, many foster homes all around places for primarily Black children in foster care, both here in the north side, down Chamberlain, and over off Mechanicsville, etc. And when you look at the issue that the city's looking at, what can we do about the courts? If you were a Black family, Black person living in Mosby Court, and you have income sufficient to live anywhere else, you would. And there are neighborhoods all around Richmond, little pockets, not in any way as integrated as someone might like, that if you had the sufficient income, you would be there. So in terms of your suggestions, I don't think you're advocating in any way that Mosby should be left alone. Let's keep people in Mosby Court. You're not advocating that.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that, or a question is, what would happen if Mosby Court was revitalized?
In the manner of what? Upgrading all the physical structure, or
And
what?
providing a sustainable income and economy for the residents there, to provide the psychological help that comes from having to navigate what, can't think of her name, but there's a book entitled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, in which there is the analysis that those of us that have to live in areas where we're continuously exploited and displaced experience some of the same, or exhibit some of the same symptoms of people that have returned from war, right? So I'm not suggesting that Mosby Court stay the way it is, or even that everything would be better if all the housing was fixed. But what I am suggesting is, what would happen if Mosby Court is created in order to invite people in and not remove people? Because Mosby Court is a community. It's groups of families that support one another. They're people that take care of other people's children. Now, the media gives us something else. Mosby Court only gets reported when there's a shooting. But there's a lot of love and there's a lot of community in spite of lack of resources in Mosby Court. And so a different analysis, I think, has to be done.
So would that be a suggestion that if somehow, magic wand, the folks in Mosby had incomes by useful work, not just getting a check from the government, but useful work, they would, and this is a question, they would choose to remain in Mosby Court rather than move down to Chamberlain Avenue or out to Mechanicsville or anywhere that their money would be sufficient. There's neighborhoods in other places; those are just the ones. Are you actually saying that even if folks were enabled through income to leave Mosby, they would choose to stay?
I think they would choose to stay if all those other infrastructure kinds of things were put into place.
If Mosby Court started looking like the neighborhoods in the rest of Richmond.
Right.
That's pretty difficult to do.
It is difficult to do, but one of the things that Lyndon Johnson tried to do with his war on poverty was to pool and pour resources. It was the foundation. It was part of the legislation of civil rights to create sustainable communities based on the residents that lived there. And so there would be banks there, and there would be schools there, there'd be churches there, there'd be businesses there. And so it's much like patterning those communities after what was termed Black Wall Street, right? So Black Wall Street was a community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was primarily The residents were primarily African American, right? And they had different socioeconomic backgrounds. And there were banks, and there were movie theaters, and there were restaurants, and there were schools, and there were churches.
That would be true of any community that sort of migrates from a lower socioeconomic level into a more middle class or lower upper middle, whichever way. So the issue is, if I'm being too reductionistic, that how would you take a group of folks who have, in effect, ended up in the lowest socioeconomic level and bring them along gradually so that they suddenly look like the flourishing Black community of Jackson Ward once upon a time, long, long ago. And I think that is a question that this country's been wrestling with, as you just said, for 50 years. But the issue is not simply what money will change.
No, it's not about what money changes.
But my question would be that people are always, I believe, making choices. There's no question that value systems and structures inhibit some of those choices. But if a person's socioeconomic resources permitted them to live elsewhere, would they truly decide to stay in the lowest socioeconomic level that they used to be in? Some extraordinary people certainly would, but most of them would actually choose for themselves or their children to move to the best community that they could afford. Or do you not agree with that?
I don't think that gets rid of our challenge as Americans.
Okay.
Because I think, first of all, maybe it's different in Richmond, but first of all, the presupposition is that the courts of Richmond started with lower socioeconomic people only.
The Mosby courts, you mean, not the court courts.
Right. Mosby Court, Gilpin, all of those. But those courts were designed to relocate displaced people from Jackson Ward.
Correct.
Right? Where they were stable and where they chose to live with one another because there was an infrastructure that gave life to who they were. And it wasn't based on just survival.
But they were, and I may be wrong, but they were still choosing whether they would choose to come and live in Gilpin or Mosby, rather than look for some little tiny house that was off of Mechanicsville somewhere, or even over in the area that is off of Cary Street. There's just different areas all around Richmond. So the persons that were displaced and then ended up in what I'm sure at the time the government thought was a noble effort, and we at least didn't build the 13th story high rises that turned into complete disasters, which I believe New York City at least tried to do for a while. But they're still exercising what choice they were able to have. And the real issue, seems to me, is what are the constraints of people being able to affect their own socioeconomic progress.
I think those constraints, I think one of the things that we try to do is to try to solve a problem based on this moment without looking at all of the policies that have led to this moment, right? Because I'm sure when the expressway was being drafted, there may have been other neighborhoods that it could have gone through.
Oh, no question. But
right. And so we live in a society that
it's going to displace somebody, and what you're pointing to is it's going to displace the people who are least able to confront or oppose. Well, and that's going to be sort of if that was what happened in Chicago, that's clearly what probably happened here. But once that happens, and now they have, in effect, been displaced into what was at least hoped would be adequate housing. The question that it suggests to me, and I have no doubt that there's a reason for community organization within Gilpin Court or Mosby Court, et cetera, But at least for some of those folks, I would fully expect them to be saying, I'm happy to work at making this better. But as soon as I make enough money, I'm not going to be living here.
But you've got testimonies of people that probably could have moved out.
Okay, but
And they'll move out into some of our neighborhoods, and we've been taught not to hate, but to distrust. Statistics show that for whatever the generic term white is, when a white person sees one black person, they automatically calculate 5. Right? Whenever a black family moves into a non-black neighborhood, then there's a shift that happens because we've been taught to fear what this neighbor may mean for what? For our children? Not necessarily so, but for what? For our property values.
Well, and in any community, that growth of diversity is necessary. Other people please jump in. There's somebody.
Whereas Christian educators deal with, or with, I don't know if you're familiar with Renovation Church in Atlanta with Lawrence D. Trump Jr. Is that what you're maybe suggesting? Or what he does is he was an ex-NFL player. But what he did was he moved inside a community that is now thriving. He didn't come in and do this whole let's renovate stuff. He's like, let's stay in the community. This is what your suggestion is, state leaders. This is what we should be doing. It's like, don't come in expecting, hey, we're going to solve your problems. Just sit down. Because now his church is one of the biggest churches we have in America. That's what he's done.
Which city is that?
What I'm saying is that we have work to do in how we've been taught and teach people how to perceive one another. Right, so I'm not talking about necessarily just the shifting of capital. There's a deeper work that has to be done, by all of us that have been given the privilege of being an American. Because as Americans, I mean, even me as an African-American woman who grew up on the south side of Chicago, that went to Northwestern University and worked in corporate America, there were some things that I gave up in order to participate. And there's some people that I left that I couldn't serve as role model for because I was given the privilege of mobility, right? And so I think for all of us, we have certain privileges that we're just not conscious of. But in that understanding of privilege, wherever we have a privilege, there's also the possibility for pain for someone else. And I think it's very interesting that, especially when we talk about low-income housing, I mean, I'm speaking from Chicago perspective as an African-American woman. But the reality was that during those times, some of those neighborhoods and people that were displaced were not of African descent. In fact, there were integrated, interfaith communities that existed, like in New Orleans. So when public housing was created, there was an intentional segregation of people, so that people of African descent had to live in this public housing, and people of European descent had to live in this public housing. Now in Richmond, I know all people of European descent are not wealthy, but we are taught not to see them. They are very invisible. When we think of poverty, rarely do we see a white family come to our minds. Right? When we think of poverty, we think about somebody in Africa or South America, but rarely do we consider those families that do not have resources and are relegated to spaces, oftentimes in mobile home parks. Right?
They used to be Oregon Hill until it became gentrified.
Right. And so I'm not talking about race. I'm talking about resources. I'm talking about how people get moved around and shifted around because there are a group of people that are designing life for all of us. And how we are unconsciously seduced into participating in it. And we even make our religion align with it so that it is acceptable, right? I don't know my Baptist history, but I'm not sure that the Baptists came to America as wealthy people, right? I know a little more about Methodist history, knowing that most of them came to America not wealthy people. I know for both of them, there was a sense of an egalitarian, relational kind of bent to what it meant to be Christians. And for all denominations, there is this process that occurs where you're good with the people, you're good in community. You know, you don't even think about being marginalized. You have truly embraced what it means to be neighbors. But as we are invited into the mainstream, then we also have to commit to mainstream values, right? And so we get treatises suggesting that people of African descent do not have souls. We have the erasure of history, where we don't talk about all of the Irish people that were enslaved in America. Over 80,000 Irish people were enslaved in America. But when we see slave, we see black, right? And we don't understand how these Irish people that were enslaved, many of them and their offspring are now in police forces. And so they've experienced post-traumatic stress. They've been taught to view people in particular ways. And now they are given the charge of keeping law and order without anybody ever talking about their history and healing from being an enslaved people. We don't talk about that. There's a book in the Historical Society that talks about white slavery. But we don't talk about that as Americans.
As I listen to your presentation, in some sense I hear you saying that it's important to ask the question, what does God want us to be about? In the midst of all of these other values. My question of you as a Richmonder now for the last 10, 15, 20 years, 3.
This is my second, third step.
Okay, for the last 3 years. What is your knowledge of people, Christian people, people of these redemptive values? What is your knowledge of such people working to make the educational system a truly good educational system? Do you know of any such in the city of Richmond for the good of the region?
I think with education, there are a lot of people that are on the ground that are trying to make education be what it's supposed to be. Right. And it's what happens in the classrooms. Right? I think it's difficult to change the whole, it's in process, but I think it's difficult to change the whole of the process when we're not willing to maybe critique how we see the intellectual abilities of all the children. Right? And so, you know, I don't live in Richmond, I live in Henrico County, and it's just as challenging because you see the disparities in what is offered in educational systems from Eastern Henrico to Western Henrico. Right? And so I just wonder what would happen if instead of being black and white, we took on a different identity that did not have us constricted, defined, and distanced. Which is, for me, which is naturally how we've been. The sharing of land and the working together on how to survive this mystery of what it means to walk in this world is very natural to what it means to be human. The ways that we're operating now, I think we've become less human. And so I think that in educational systems, I think there are people that are trying to create environments that realize that all children have this wonderful ability to create a world that's hospitable to us all, right? And just do until we teach them differently, right? Probably all of us in the room have been morally tutored to see particular people in particular ways, whether intentional or unintentional, conscious, or subconsciously.
So this, what I hear you saying is that there are individuals that work in these redemptive ways, but I don't hear you yet speaking of any groups, church or non-church, or mixed both, who are working in these redemptive ways to try to develop an educational system that values it.
Yeah, I think that there are a collective of churches in parts of Richmond and East End in Eastern Henrico that are bringing education to the forefront. But right now it only looks like kind of resistance as opposed to a larger group of collectives that are willing to risk the possibility that there are enough resources for all the children. There's always this calculation. I think it's grounded in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethic, right? Where justice is proportional. Okay, so the people that have the might to determine the value of everyone else, they've decided that the person that owns the corporation is always going to be more valuable than the person that goes to work every day, which is what's going on nationally now with Verizon strike. And I think the difficult thing is those of us that really do have the power to change and to do some type of transformation, we really do get stuck in the tension of trying to hold on to what we know instead of the difficult work of imagining something different and trying to resource it. For me, it's the difference between when I lived here before, it was Richmond, right? And now I see RVA, right? For me, Richmond represented this embrace of history as moral tutor that restricted and restrained and confined so many people in the city. Right? But then we have this move of RBA that's got a different life and has the potential to bring a different way of being, but only if we critique at the level that we do not see. I'm working with a student now who is engaged in social enterprise. And he has, through his time as a business person, gathered interracial, interethnic, interfaith groups in order to bring forth this thing that we love, called the food truck, thing that we love it, right? And so he convenes these groups. And then he gets told by one of his partners that his father, who was going to help support this, would no longer help support as long as his son is doing business with a black man. Right? And this wonderful collective of food truck people have now taken the ideas and that had such great potential to be life-giving. Because if we can agree on food, if we can come to a table together, there's nothing that can stop us. But this collective has now moved and made sure that this particular student has no power and no say in the collective. And most of us don't see how these things operate. Most of us are left with the stress of seeing the community, maybe not in Baptist churches, but for many Baptist churches and Methodist churches, you're experiencing and we're experiencing the stress that the communities around us have changed. True or not true? Right? And so for some of us, the response is, let's create online communities, faith communities, right? And we have churches online. And some of us, I know in Chicagoland area, some churches that were predominantly white have invited black women to pastor the churches in hopes that this minister might be able to resuscitate something in such a way that the church can now be seen as part of the community. But it doesn't happen because they haven't excavated the value system that allowed this condition to occur. The reason churches and communities have shifted are because of housing policies that most of us have not been privy to. We've not paid attention to.
All right.
I think I'm gonna have to call time there. I know this is a wonderful discussion. I don't know about that. But thank you for joining me and thanking Dr. Gise Johnson. I hope that this conversation continues, not just around the tables, but certainly there, and continues on as we think about ways that we can continue to be neighbors to one another and what that it actually means in effect. I do want to thank the Hampton Baptist Church and Chester Brown for sponsoring this series. We are grateful for their gifts to make this happen. Know that there will be another coffee and conversation series as well as cousins lectures next year. We are in the process of working through those dates, and we'll get those out to you so that you can be a part of that event as well. Please stay for lunch and continue the conversation there. And as we go, let me pray for our food. Gracious God, we thank you for challenging words. God, we know that there is brokenness all around us. But God, give us imaginations to be agents of healing, hope, peace in the world around us. As we share food together, we pray that you would bless it to nourish our bodies, bless our conversations that will continue, that they might move us forward and creating a world that you have called us to. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.